Chains clattered to the stone floor as the Lycan warlord granted unimaginable freedom to the weeping murderers, thieves, and beggars of Oakhaven Dungeon. The heavy iron doors had screamed open to herald his arrival, but his sweeping mercy abruptly vanished the moment he reached Genevieve, eclipsing her miserable cage in shadow, his golden eyes locked onto hers. "You're coming with me." For 3 years, the only measure of time she had in the belly of Oakhaven Keep was the slow, rhythmic dripping of water from the vaulted ceiling and the agonizingly predictable rotation of the guards. Her name was Genevieve Sterling, though the wardens knew her simply as Prisoner 84. She shared a 6x8 cell with an elderly woman named Beatrice, whose mind had fractured long before her body began to fail. They existed in a purgatory of damp stone, surviving on molded bread and the faint, cruel memories of the sun. But tonight, the dripping water was drowned out by the sound of the world ending above them. It started just after midnight. The heavy thud of battering rams against the keep's outer gates vibrated through the bedrock, rattling Genevieve's teeth and shaking the iron bars of their cage. Then came the screams. They were not the sounds of a standard human siege. These shrieks were abruptly cut short, accompanied by the deep, guttural roars that every child in the Northern Territories was taught to fear. The Blackwood Pack had breached the walls. For decades, the human lords had encroached on the lycanthrope territories, burning their forests for lumber and slaughtering their scouts. Lord Alistair, the brutal governor of Oakhaven, and a man Genevieve knew far too intimately, had been the primary instigator. He had built his reputation on the pelts of their dead. Now, the wolves had come to collect his debt. "The demons are in the walls, Jenny," Beatrice whimpered, clutching her tattered shawl around her frail shoulders. She pressed herself into the darkest corner of their cell, her eyes wide with a terror that cut through her usual dementia. "They're going to eat us in the dark." "Hush, Bea," Genevieve whispered, pulling the older woman close. Her own heart hammered frantically against her ribs, but she forced her voice to remain steady. "They want Alistair. They don't care about the dregs in the dungeon." She was wrong. The heavy oak door at the top of the dungeon stairs splintered inward with a deafening crack. The torches lining the stone walls flickered wildly as a rush of cold, blood-scented night air swept down the corridor. Footsteps echoed heavy, booted, and unnervingly synchronized. Genevieve held her breath, pulling Beatrice behind her, waiting for the slaughter. But what happened next defied every terrifying legend she had ever been told. A dozen men flooded the corridor. They were massive, clad in dark leather and chainmail, their faces smeared with ash and the unmistakable crimson of a fresh kill. Yet, they did not draw their swords on the caged humans. Instead, the vanguard carried massive iron key rings, freshly stripped from the dead guards upstairs. "Open them all," a voice commanded. It was deep, resonant, and carried an absolute authority that made the hair on the back of Genevieve's neck stand up. She pressed her face against the cold iron bars, trying to see the speaker. The Lycan soldiers moved methodically. They jammed the keys into the heavy locks of the cells. Clack, clack, clack. The heavy doors swung open. "Get out!" One of the soldiers barked at a cell full of condemned thieves. "Run to the forests! Run to the cities! Tell them Lord Alistair is dead, and the Alpha of Blackwood has unchained his sins." It was a brilliant, terrifying tactical move. By releasing Oakhaven's worst criminals, the wolves were ensuring that chaos would follow the humans long after the pack had retreated. The dungeon erupted into a frenzy. Prisoners stumbled out of their cages, weeping, laughing, pushing past the massive soldiers who simply stood back and watched them flee like frightened rats. Then, the soldier with the keys stepped up to Genevieve's cell. He raised the iron ring. "Stop." The single word cut through the chaos of the fleeing prisoners. The soldier froze, the key hovering inches from the lock. He stepped back immediately, bowing his head in submission. From the shadows of the staircase, a man emerged. He didn't wear a crown, but he didn't need to. The sheer gravity of his presence choked the air from the corridor. He was well over 6 feet tall, his broad shoulders draped in a heavy, fur-lined cloak that swallowed the ambient light. His jaw was covered in dark, coarse scruff, and a jagged, silver-white scar cut through his left eyebrow. But it was his eyes that pinned Genevieve to the floorboards. They were a piercing, unnatural amber, the color of a dying sun. This was Andrew Blackwood, the Alpha King, the Butcher of the North. He walked slowly down the corridor, his heavy boots splashing lightly in the puddles of stagnant water. He ignored the fleeing prisoners. He ignored the stench of the dungeon. His gaze was locked entirely on her. He stopped directly in front of her cell. The silence between them stretched, heavy and suffocating. He leaned in slightly, his nose flaring as he took a slow, deliberate breath. Genevieve knew what she looked like. A starved, filthy wretch in a burlap sack, her brown hair matted with grime. But as he inhaled, his pupils dilated until his eyes were almost entirely black. He wasn't looking at a prisoner. He was hunting a scent. "Open it," Andrew commanded, his voice a low rumble that vibrated against the iron bars. The soldier rushed forward, unlocked the door, and pulled it open. "Go on, old woman," the soldier snapped at Beatrice. "Run." Beatrice scrambled past Genevieve, terror lending her sudden speed. She darted out of the cell and vanished up the stairs. Genevieve moved to follow her, her legs trembling, her heart daring to hope. But as she took a step toward the open doorway, Andrew shifted his massive frame, completely blocking her path. She froze. She looked up at him, forcing herself not to bare her throat in a primal display of submission. "Every other soul in this rot hole walks free tonight," Andrew said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly intimate register. He reached out, his large, calloused hand gripping the iron bars of the open door. He leaned down until his mouth was mere inches from her ear, his breath hot against her freezing skin. "But you," he whispered, "you're coming with me." Panic, cold and sharp, flooded her veins. "Why?" The words scraped out of her dry throat before she could stop it. Andrew Blackwood didn't answer. He simply reached forward, his massive hand wrapping around her upper arm. His grip was an iron vice, impossibly hot against her shivering skin. He didn't drag her. He merely pulled her forward with a force that made it clear resistance was physically impossible. "Move," he commanded softly. She stumbled alongside him as he led her out of the dungeon and up the spiraling stone stairs. When they broke through the heavy oak doors into the main courtyard of Oakhaven Keep, the sight stopped the breath in her lungs. The fortress was a graveyard. Lord Alistair's personal guard, the elite soldiers who had tormented the local villages for a decade, lay scattered across the cobblestones like broken dolls. The keep's blue and silver banners were burning violently in the night wind, casting a hellish dancing orange glow over the carnage. The metallic tang of fresh blood was so thick she could taste it on the back of her tongue. A massive black warhorse stood waiting near the shattered main gates. A man with sandy blonde hair and a rugged, blood-spattered face stood beside it, wiping a broadsword with a piece of a fallen soldier's tunic. "The keep is secured, Alpha," the man said, looking up. His eyes darted to Genevieve, narrowing in confusion. "The armory is stripped, and the granary is burning. But what is this?" "She rides with us, Gideon," Andrew said, effortlessly hoisting her by the waist and depositing her onto the front of the saddle. Her hands grabbed frantically at the horse's coarse mane to steady herself. Gideon Croft, Andrew's beta, if the northern rumors were true, stepped closer, his brow furrowed. "A human slave?" "Andrew, we don't take thralls. You know the laws of the pack. Besides, she looks like she's going to snap in half in the wind. She'll slow us down." "She is not a slave," Andrew replied, swinging himself up into the saddle directly behind her. His chest pressed against her back, a solid, terrifying wall of heat. He reached around her to grab the reins, effectively trapping her within his arms. "And she won't slow us down. Mount up. We ride for the Vane encampment before the Human King's reinforcements arrive." She sat rigid as the horse surged forward, joining a column of 50 heavily armed Lycan warriors. The wind whipped her face, freezing the tears of pure terror that finally spilled from her eyes. She was a prisoner again, simply traded from an iron cage to a gilded, terrifying one. The ride was a blur of dark pines and freezing wind. Andrew didn't speak a word to her. He didn't handle her roughly, but he didn't offer comfort either. He simply rode with a relentless, mechanical efficiency. Hours later, the sun began to bleed over the horizon, painting the jagged peaks of the Vane Mountains in pale gold. They descended into a hidden valley, heavily forested and shrouded in thick morning mist. Here, nestled among ancient, towering redwoods, was the Lycan war camp. Dozens of large canvas tents were pitched around roaring fire pits. As they rode in, men and women emerged to watch them. There were no cheers of victory, only solemn nods. Genevieve noticed immediately that the camp felt subdued. A heavy, suffocating scent hung in the air underneath the smoke, the sweet, sickening smell of decaying flesh and rotting herbs. As a trained apothecary, her nose immediately identified the underlying notes: white willow, dried blood, and the unmistakable, acrid sting of heavy silver poisoning. Andrew dismounted and reached up, pulling her down from the horse. Her legs, atrophied from 3 years in a cell and numb from the ride, buckled instantly. She expected to hit the dirt, but Andrew caught her, holding her upright by her elbows. "Bring her to my tent," Andrew ordered Gideon, who had just dismounted beside them, "and bring the physician's lockbox." "Andrew, you can't be serious," Gideon hissed, stepping into the Alpha's path. "You brought an infected human straight into the heart of our camp? If she has the rot." "She doesn't have the rot, Gideon," Andrew said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, vibrating growl. "Do as you are told." Andrew pushed her gently but firmly toward the largest tent in the center of the camp. Inside, it was Spartan, a heavy fur bedroll, a wooden table covered in maps, and a roaring iron stove. He steered her toward a wooden stool by the fire and forced her to sit. She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering uncontrollably as the warmth of the stove hit her freezing skin. Andrew stood across the table, watching her with those piercing amber eyes. He slowly unclasped his heavy cloak, throwing it over a chair. Underneath, he wore a simple black tunic that clung to his heavily muscled chest. "You're terrified," he stated. It wasn't a question. He was reading her heart rate, her scent. "You slaughtered an entire garrison and kidnapped me," she managed to whisper, her voice shaking. "Should I be flattered?" A ghost of a smirk played on his lips, but it vanished instantly. He reached into the leather pouch at his belt and pulled out a small, intricately carved wooden box. He set it on the table between them. "Do you know what is happening in the Lycan territories, human?" Andrew asked, leaning his hands on the table. "I've been locked in a lightless box for 3 years," she replied bitterly. "I don't know what's happening outside the keep's walls. My people are dying," Andrew said, his voice devoid of emotion, though she saw the muscle in his jaw feather. "A sickness is sweeping through the vein packs. We call it the silver rot. It attacks our blood, turns our healing against us, and rots us from the inside out. It is not natural. It was engineered." Genevieve swallowed hard. "A biological weapon. Lord Alistair." "Yes." Andrew reached out and flipped the latch on the wooden box. He pushed it across the table toward her. "Alistair's soldiers have been poisoning our water supplies at the border for 4 years." She looked down into the box. Inside lay a single dried flower. The petals were a deep, unnatural violet, veined with pure silver. She felt the blood drain entirely from her face. Her stomach violently rebelled. It was a mutated strain of wolfsbane, her mutated strain. 4 years ago, Andrew continued, his eyes locked onto her face, watching her horrific realization dawn. Alistair commissioned a young, brilliant apothecary from the capital to find an agricultural solution for crop blight. He gave her endless funding and a private laboratory. She created a botanical agent that could aggressively overwrite the cellular structure of invasive weeds. Genevieve couldn't breathe. The walls of the tent felt like they were shrinking. When she realized what Lord Alistair actually intended to use the agent for, that he was weaponizing it with liquid silver to exterminate my kind, she tried to destroy her research. Andrew said softly. Alistair couldn't have that. But he couldn't kill her either, because she was the only one who knew the exact chemical bindings. So, he locked her in his dungeon, ensuring no one could ever force her to synthesize a cure. Andrew walked slowly around the table, stopping just inches from where she sat trembling. He reached down, his large fingers gently lifting her chin, forcing her to meet his golden eyes. "You aren't Clara Hemlock, a peasant thief," Andrew whispered. "You are Lady Genevieve Sterling, the illegitimate daughter of the king, and the architect of my people's ruin." He dropped his hand, his gaze burning into her. "And you are going to fix it, or I will let Gideon kill you." The silence in the Alpha's tent was absolute, broken only by the crackle of the iron stove and the ragged, shallow breaths of the dying just outside the canvas walls. Genevieve stared at the dried, silver-veined petal in the wooden box, the damning proof of her own horrific naivety. "I wanted to stop a famine," she whispered, the words tasting like ash. "The southern crops were failing. Children were starving in the streets of the capital. King Reginald, my father, told me my botanical research could synthesize a fertilizer potent enough to save millions. I didn't know Lord Alistair was taking my work to the north. I swear to you, I didn't know he was binding it with quicksilver." Andrew watched her, his expression unreadable. "Ignorance is a luxury the dead cannot afford, Genevieve. Alistair took your miracle and weaponized it. The mutated wolfsbane acts as an anchor. It latches onto our cellular structure and prevents our bodies from expelling the silver. Our natural healing factor is turned completely against us. The harder a lichen fights the infection, the faster the silver eats their organs. He turned his back to her, stepping toward the flap of the tent. Gideon will bring you whatever surviving equipment we salvaged from Alistair's keep. You have the protection of my pack, a warm bed, and all the provisions you require. But if you do not find a way to break the chemical bond of the rot, I will throw you to the grieving mothers of this camp. For the next 2 weeks, the Alpha's tent became a frantic, makeshift apothecary. Gideon Croft delivered crates of stolen glassware, mortar and pestles, and raw chemical agents, slamming them onto the wooden tables with barely contained hostility. The Beta made no secret of his disgust for her. To him, she was not a captive, she was the plague bringer. The only lichen who showed her an ounce of grace was an elderly healer named Maeve. She was missing her left eye, a souvenir from a human blade, and walked with a heavy limp, but her hands were as gentle as a summer breeze. Maeve brought her the blood samples of the infected. The vials were a horrifying sight. The dark, rich crimson of lichen blood was streaked with a metallic, toxic sheen. "The silver is too deeply embedded," Genevieve muttered to Maeve one evening, dragging a hand through her unwashed hair. The wooden table was littered with failed experiments, vials of boiling liquids that had either exploded or curdled into useless sludge. "Standard antidotes won't work. The wolfsbane mutation I created is too resilient. It needs a solvent, something powerful enough to shock the cellular structure into resetting itself. Our bodies are built to regenerate, little bird," Maeve said softly, grinding dried nettle in a stone bowl. "What if the cure isn't about destroying the poison, but supercharging the host?" Genevieve froze, staring at the flickering lantern light reflecting off the glassware. "Supercharging the host. The blood," she breathed, her heart kicking against her ribs. "The blood in these samples belongs to standard pack members. Their immune systems are strong, but they are already compromised by the time the rot sets in. To create a universal catalyst, a serum that can break the silver bond and jumpstart the healing process, I need an uninfected regenerative agent, something impossibly potent." She looked up at Maeve. "I need alpha blood." The temperature in the tent seemed to drop 10 degrees as the canvas flap was pushed aside. Andrew ducked inside, shedding a cloak heavy with fresh snow. He had heard every word. His heightened hearing meant he likely heard her racing pulse from a mile away. "You need my blood," Andrew stated, his deep voice leaving no room for argument. "It's a risk," she warned, stepping away from the table as he approached. "If I mix the catalyst wrong, and you inject it, the rot will bind to your system instantly. It will kill you faster than the others because your metabolism burns hotter." Andrew didn't hesitate. He walked directly to the table, unlaced the leather gauntlet on his right arm, and rolled up the sleeve of his black tunic. He grabbed a silver-edged hunting knife from his belt. "Do it." She stepped close to him. It was the nearest she had been to him since the ride from Oakhaven. Up close, he smelled of pine needles, wood smoke, and a dangerous, intoxicating masculinity. Her hands shook as she took the knife from his grip. "I need a deep cut," she murmured, staring at his corded forearm. "I need at least a pint to synthesize enough serum for a trial. Then cut deeply." "Genevieve." She pressed the blade to his skin and drew it down. Blood welled instantly thick, impossibly dark, and radiating a heat that warmed her freezing fingers. She held a glass beaker beneath his arm, watching the life force of the Alpha King fill the vessel. He didn't flinch. His golden eyes remained locked onto her face, tracking every flicker of emotion across her features. "Why did King Reginald leave you in the dungeon?" Andrew asked suddenly, his voice a low rumble vibrating in the small space. She swallowed hard, keeping her eyes on the vial. "Because I figured it out. I found a ledger in Alistair's study 3 years ago. It detailed the shipments of liquid silver, funded directly by the Crown. My father wasn't trying to stop a famine. He was paying Alistair to orchestrate a genocide, and he used his bastard daughter to build the weapon. When I threatened to expose them to the High Council, Alistair locked me away. My father let him." Andrew reached out with his free hand, his calloused thumb gently wiping away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. The touch was shocking, tender, possessive, and entirely unexpected from the Butcher of the North. "The human king threw you to the dark," Andrew whispered fiercely, "but the wolves pulled you into the light. Do not forget who your enemies are, Genevieve." She pulled the full beaker away, grabbing a clean linen cloth to bind his arm, but as she pressed the cloth to his skin, the deep laceration was already knitting itself back together, the tissue fusing seamlessly before her eyes. "Let's make the cure," she said. a new, hardened resolve settling in her chest. She worked through the night, blending the Alpha's blood with the botanical counteragents. The mixture hissed and smoked, turning from a toxic silver to a vibrant, glowing amber, the exact color of Andrew's eyes. By dawn, she had successfully synthesized 3 heavy glass syringes of the cure. She was holding the first syringe up to the lantern light when the war horn shattered the morning air. It was a sharp, brassy sound that belonged to the Royal Vanguard. King Reginald's elite forces had found them. Ambush! Gideon's roar echoed through the camp, followed immediately by the sickening thud of heavy artillery. The ground shuddered beneath her feet. She rushed to the tent flap and threw it open. The misty valley had become a slaughterhouse. Hundreds of human soldiers, clad in the gold and crimson armor of the crown, were pouring over the eastern ridge. They weren't using standard arrows. They were firing heavy ballista bolts wrapped in burning pitch and laced with liquid silver. Tents were engulfed in flames. Lycans, who were already weak from the rot, were cut down before they could even attempt to shift. "Genevieve, get back inside!" Andrew materialized from the smoke, his chest heaving. He was no longer entirely human. His jaw had elongated, his canines extending into lethal fangs, and thick, dark claws protracted from his fingertips. The partial shift was a terrifying display of raw, apex power. "They tracked the supply wagons we stole from Alistair," Andrew snarled, shoving her back into the tent. "Commander Bradley is leading them. They brought heavy silver artillery. Hide under the table and do not make a sound." "Andrew, the cure," she started, grabbing the syringe. Before she could finish, a deafening crash tore through the canvas above them. A massive, silver-tipped ballista bolt ripped through the ceiling of the tent, striking Andrew directly in the back of his right shoulder. The sound he made was a horrifying, guttural scream of absolute agony. The impact threw his massive frame forward, crashing into the wooden table and shattering her equipment. The silver began acting instantly. Black, necrotic veins exploded across his neck and face as the poisoned metal burned through his flesh. "Andrew!" she screamed, dropping to her knees beside him. The Alpha was convulsing on the dirt floor, gasping for air as the rot flooded his system at an accelerated rate. The wound was smoking, the scent of burning meat filling the tent. Outside, the sounds of battle raged, the clash of steel, the roars of the wolves, and the triumphant shouts of the human vanguard. "Run!" Andrew choked out, his golden eyes dimming to a milky, sickly pale. "Jenny, run!" "I am done running," she gritted her teeth. She scrambled to the scattered remains of her workstation. Miraculously, the leather satchel holding the 3 syringes had survived the crash. She grabbed one, her hand slick with Andrew's dark blood. She crawled back to him, straddling his massive chest to hold him down as the convulsions worsened. "Hold still, damn you!" she sobbed, uncapping the thick iron needle. She didn't hesitate. She plunged the syringe directly into the blackening veins of his neck and slammed the plunger down, flooding his bloodstream with the amber catalyst. For 3 agonizing seconds, nothing happened. Andrew went entirely still. His chest stopped moving. "No," she whispered, pressing her hands to his face. "No, please." Then, his eyes snapped open. The milky film vanished, replaced by a blazing, molten gold. A shockwave of pure energy seemed to violently erupt from his body, throwing her backward onto the dirt. Andrew roared, a sound so loud and terrible it shook the earth. He grabbed the heavy wooden shaft of the ballista bolt lodged in his shoulder and, with a sickening crunch, ripped it out of his own flesh. The necrotic rot on his skin reversed instantly, the tissue rapidly regenerating as the cure aggressively purged the silver from his system. He stood up, towering over her, his partial shift completing. He was a nightmare of muscle, fur, and rage. He looked down at her, his chest heaving, a terrifying intelligence burning in his eyes. "Stay here," the Alpha commanded, his voice a distorted, demonic growl. The Alpha King hit the vanguard lines like a falling star. He tore through the armored soldiers with horrifying ease, a blur of claws and teeth. Seeing their Alpha miraculously healed and fighting with unmatched ferocity, the remaining Blackwood wolves rallied. The tide of the battle turned in seconds. Gideon, roaring a battle cry, shifted fully and joined his king. Within minutes, the human soldiers were broken. Commander Bradley was ripped from his horse by Andrew himself. His neck snapped like dry kindling. The remaining vanguard fled back over the ridge, abandoning their weapons in the snow. The camp fell eerily silent, save for the crackle of burning tents. Andrew stood amidst the carnage, chest heaving, his dark fur coated in the blood of the king's men. Slowly, his massive form began to shrink, his bones cracking and shifting as he returned to his human state. He turned, locking eyes with her where she stood at the edge of the ruined tent. He walked toward her, ignoring his beta and his warriors. He stopped inches away, breathing heavily, his broad chest rising and falling. He reached out, his blood-soaked hand cupping her cheek. "You saved me," he said, his voice raw. "You saved me first," she replied, leaning into his touch, the terror of the morning melting into an undeniable, overwhelming warmth. He leaned down, pressing his forehead against hers. "The king will send more men. He knows you are alive, and he knows you have the cure. Let him send them," she whispered fiercely, looking up into his amber eyes. "They will find the Alpha King, and they will find me." Andrew smiled, a genuine, breathtaking curve of his lips. He pulled her against his chest, burying his face in her hair as the surviving members of the pack began to howl their victory to the dawn. The iron doors of Oakhaven broke her, but the Alpha of the Blackwood pack forged her anew. She was no longer prisoner 84, nor was she the discarded bastard of a treacherous king. She was Genevieve Blackwood, the architect of their salvation. As Andrew stood beside her, his golden eyes reflecting the dawn, she knew the war was far from over. But this time, she was holding the keys.